The rain came down in a slow, miserable drizzle, turning the dusty street of Perdition's Folly into a river of thick, brown mud. It was the kind of rain that didn't wash anything clean, but only deepened the grime, soaking into the unpainted clapboard of the buildings and dripping from the broken eaves of the saloon. Dusk was settling in, a bruised purple stain spreading across the gray sky, and the few souls hardy or foolish enough to be out were gathered in a loose, hunched circle around a trader's wagon. The wagon had seen better days, its canvas cover patched and stained, its wheels caked with the mud of a dozen territories. A single lantern hung from a hook, casting a sickly yellow glow on the scene. It illuminated the trader, a portly man named Silas Croft with a waistcoat stretched tight over his belly and a smile that showed too many teeth. He was a man who sold whatever could be bought: tin pots, cheap whiskey, salted meat, and, on this particular evening, human flesh. Chained to the wagon's back wheel was the girl. Her name was May, though no one here knew it, and she had long since forgotten the sound of it spoken with any kindness. Her dress, once a pale calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with filth. Her bare feet were bruised and cut, sinking into the cold mud. Her face, framed by tangled brown hair plastered to her skin by the rain, was a mask of hollowed-out despair. She wasn't wailing or screaming. The sound had been beaten out of her long ago. Instead, tears traced clean paths through the dirt on her cheeks, a silent, ceaseless river of grief that no one in the assembled crowd seemed to notice or care to. "A fine, strong girl," Silas announced, his voice oiled with a salesman's false cheer. He gestured toward May as if she were a broodmare. "Hardly 17 years of age, good teeth, strong back for work in the field or the house. Quiet, too. Won't give a man no trouble." A few men in the crowd laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. One of them, a lanky drover with a stained beard, called out, "I can think of other work she's good for. Silas, does she do that quiet too?" More laughter followed, spattering the heavy air. May flinched, pulling her shoulders in, trying to make herself smaller. She stared at the ground, at the way the mud oozed between her toes, focusing on the cold numbness of it. It was better than looking at their faces, at the vacant cruelty in their eyes. She had seen those eyes before, on other men in other towns. They were all the same. They looked at her and saw an object, a thing to be used and discarded. The apathy was worse than the outright malice. It was the look of men who saw her suffering as nothing more than a mild diversion on a rainy evening. A stout woman with a pinched face, standing in the doorway of the dry goods store, scowled. "It's a disgrace, bringing that sort of business to a decent town," but she made no move to intervene. Her disapproval as useless as a prayer in a gunfight. She was just another face in the crowd, a spectator to the slow, grinding destruction of a life. It was then that he rode into town. He came from the west, with the last of the dying light behind him, so that he appeared first as a silhouette against the blood-red slash of the horizon. He rode a tall buckskin horse that moved with a weary but steady gait, its head low. The man on its back sat slumped in the saddle, a figure of profound exhaustion, his hat pulled low against the rain. Dust and dried mud clung to his long coat, signs of a hard journey. He was just another rider, another nameless drifter passing through a town that was little more than a smudge on the map. No one paid him much mind. He guided his horse toward the livery stable, his gaze sweeping over the dreary town without interest, until it settled on the small crowd by the trader's wagon. He slowed his horse, his head tilting just enough to take in the scene. The lantern light caught the hard lines of his face, a square jaw dark with stubble, a straight nose, and a mouth set in a permanent, unreadable line. His name was Elias, and the stone-faced expression he wore was a wall he had built long ago, brick by painful brick. His eyes passed over the jeering men, over the slick smile of the trader, and then they found May, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elias went still. The weariness in his posture vanished, replaced by a rigid, unnerving focus. He saw the chain on her wrist. He saw the tear tracks on her dirt-smeared cheeks. But what he truly saw, what struck him with the force of a physical blow, was the emptiness in her eyes. It was a hollowed-out look of utter surrender, the look of a soul that had given up the fight because it could no longer remember what it was fighting for. He had seen that look once before, years ago, in the smoke and fire of a burning cabin, on a face he had loved more than his own, the face of his younger sister, Sarah. He had been too slow then, too hesitant. He had failed her, and the guilt was a phantom that rode with him every day, its cold fingers forever wrapped around his heart, in the shivering, broken girl chained to the wagon. Elias saw Sarah's ghost. He saw his failure given a second, terrible life. The world around him seemed to fade away. The rain, the mud, the crude laughter of the crowd, it all became a distant hum. There was only the girl and the crushing weight of his own past. He had not been able to save Sarah, but he was here now. Without a sound, without a single word to betray the storm raging inside him. Elias swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. His boots made a soft sucking sound as they sank into the mud. He left his horse standing, ground-hitched by training and exhaustion, and began to walk toward the wagon. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of a vague animal instinct that warned them away from a man who moved with such silent, deliberate purpose. They registered him now, the Colt peacemaker tied low on his hip, the cold stillness in his gray eyes. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. The lewd jokes died on their lips, replaced by curious murmurs. Silas Croft, the trader, watched him approach, his greasy smile faltering for a moment. He sized Elias up, saw the worn-out clothes and the trail dust, and dismissed him as another broke drifter. "Looking for a bargain, friend?" he asked, his confidence returning. "This one's going cheap. $20. Silver." Elias didn't answer. He didn't even look at the trader. His eyes were fixed on May, on the raw, red chafe mark where the iron cuff bit into her wrist. He stopped directly in front of Silas, close enough that the trader could smell the rain and the road on him, from a worn leather pouch at his belt. Elias pulled a drawstring bag made of heavy canvas. It was heavy, and it clinked with the solid, unmistakable sound of coin. He didn't bother to count it. He didn't bargain. He simply opened his hand and let the pouch drop. It landed at the trader's feet with a heavy, final thud. A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. This was not how these things were done. There was supposed to be a back and forth, a crude haggling that was as much a part of the entertainment as the purchase itself. This silent, abrupt act was unsettling. Silas Croft stared at the pouch in the mud, then up at the stranger's cold, unblinking face. A nervous laugh escaped his lips. "Well now, no need for formalities. I suppose." He bent down, his knees cracking, and snatched up the pouch. He loosened the drawstring and peered inside. His eyes widened. It was filled with silver dollars, far more than the 20 he had asked for. It was enough to buy the girl 10 times over. He looked up, a question on his lips, but Elias had already turned his attention away. He reached down and took the length of chain from Silas's hand. The metal was cold and heavy. He looked at May, who was staring at him now, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She had been bought. The transaction was over, and now came the part she knew all too well. Elias held the chain, but he didn't pull it. He just stood there for a moment, letting her see him. He wanted her to understand that the violence of the crowd was over. Then he turned and began to walk away, the chain held loosely in his hand. After a few steps, he felt a faint, hesitant tug as she rose from the mud and followed, a small, chained shadow trailing behind a silent stranger. He led her to his horse, retrieved the reins, and walked on. Heading toward the edge of the miserable little town, the crowd watched them go, their murmurs a low buzz of speculation. No one understood what they had just seen. The man hadn't smiled, hadn't gloated, hadn't even looked at his purchase with the kind of assessing eye they expected. He had simply paid and walked away, as if he were collecting a piece of luggage. Just outside the town, nestled in a grove of skeletal-looking cottonwoods, stood a run-down cabin. It was little more than a shack, abandoned by some hopeful prospector who had long since given up. The roof sagged and a cold wind whistled through the gaps between the logs, but it was shelter from the rain. Elias pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside, leading May after him. The interior was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay. Elias set about building a fire in the stone hearth, his movements economical and precise. He never once spoke to her. He didn't tell her to sit or to help or to do anything at all. He simply moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture, a silent presence in the small, dark room. May stood by the door, dripping water and mud onto the dirt floor, her body rigid with terror. Every sound, the scratch of the match, the crackle of the kindling catching fire, the sigh of the logs as they began to burn, made her flinch. She watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and lean, and she knew the kind of strength he possessed. She had felt that strength before, in the hands of other men. She waited for the inevitable, the command, the shove, the blow. She waited for him to turn and claim what he had paid for. But he did none of those things. Once the fire was blazing, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He shrugged off his wet coat and hung it on a peg. He opened his saddlebags and took out a strip of dried beef and a water skin, placing them on the floor near her, but not too near. It was an offering, left for her to take or leave. Then he unrolled his bedroll, a thick wool blanket and a worn sheepskin, and placed it in the driest corner of the cabin, farthest from the leaky roof. He straightened it out, then looked at her for the first time since they had left the wagon. His gray eyes held no lust, no anger, not even pity. They held a deep, profound sorrow that she was too young and too scared to understand. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the bedroll. An invitation. Then he turned, picked up his rifle, and walked back out into the rain-swept darkness, pulling the cabin door almost shut behind him, leaving just a crack for air. May stood frozen for a long time, listening to the sound of the rain and the crackling fire. She didn't understand. Men who bought girls like her did not give them their own bed. They did not leave them food and water and then walk away. They did not sleep outside in the cold and the wet. Her mind, conditioned by months of brutality, could not process this quiet, inexplicable act. Slowly, hesitantly, she crept toward the fire, drawn by its warmth. She picked up the jerky and ate it ravenously, her first real food in days. She drank from the water skin, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. And then she looked at the bedroll. It looked impossibly soft, impossibly warm. Outside, the last of the sun's light had vanished completely, leaving a world of impenetrable black. The wind howled through the broken hills, a mournful, lonely sound, and in the distance, a coyote called out to the empty plains. The wilderness was a vast, uncaring thing, as brutal and indifferent as the men in the town. Elias sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, his rifle across his lap, facing the cabin door. The rain had slowed to a fine mist. He pulled his hat down further and stared up at the sky, where the clouds had begun to break apart, revealing a spray of cold, distant stars. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching, standing guard over the ghost in the cabin. He had failed to protect one girl from the horrors of this world. He would not fail another. Inside, May finally gave in. She lay down on the bedroll, pulling the thick wool blanket over her trembling body. The sheepskin was soft beneath her, and the warmth of the fire seeped into her chilled bones. She lay there, listening to the wind and the coyotes, every muscle in her body still tensed for a fight that never came. She was safe, at least for tonight. She was warm. She had food in her belly, but she was more confused and frightened than ever. He had bought her. He had paid a fortune for her. Why? Why hadn't he hurt her? The question echoed in the silent, terrified corners of her mind, a single, persistent beat in the overwhelming darkness. And for the first time in a very long time, May lay awake crying, not from pain, but from a confusion so deep it felt like its own kind of wound. The sun rose thin and pale, filtering through the grime on the cabin's single window and casting a weak gray light across the dirt floor. May woke with a start, her body instantly rigid, the memory of where she was crashing down on her. But the room was empty. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers, offering a faint warmth. The man was gone. For a moment, a wild, panicked hope surged through her. He had left her. She was free, but the hope was tangled with a deeper, more familiar terror. Alone, out here. She was as good as dead. Her freedom would be a short, brutal thing, ending at the hands of the first man or beast to find her. The thought was a cold weight in her stomach. The cabin door creaked open, and she flinched, scrambling back against the wall, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. Elias stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the brightening sky. He held 2 rabbits, limp and bloody, in one hand. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness of her, a quiet, steady presence that was entirely different from the predatory attention she was used to. He moved to the hearth, set the rabbits down, and began to skin them with a practiced efficiency that was both fascinating and frightening to watch. His hands were large and calloused, but they moved with a surgeon's precision. He cooked the meat on a sharpened stick over the rebuilt fire. The smell filled the small cabin, a rich, savory scent that made May's stomach ache with hunger. When it was done, he slid a portion onto a tin plate he took from his saddlebag and set it on the floor, near where she huddled. Again, not too close. He took his own portion and went to sit on the cabin's threshold, his back to her, watching the morning unfold. He ate slowly, deliberately. He did not speak. He did not command her to eat. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. She was a wild, cornered animal, and he was a man who seemed to understand that the only way to earn trust was to not demand it. After a long while, her hunger won out over her fear. She crept forward and took the plate, retreating to her corner to eat, her eyes never leaving his back. They left an hour later. He doused the fire, packed his few belongings, and whistled for his buckskin horse, which had been grazing nearby. He motioned for May to come outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the grim squalor of perdition's folly. The sky was a vast, aching blue. He swung himself into the saddle, then reached a hand down to her. She stared at it, her mind racing. To touch him was to surrender a piece of herself, but to refuse was an act of defiance she couldn't afford. Hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm but not crushing. He pulled her up with an easy strength, settling her behind him on the horse's rump. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching the back of his saddle, careful not to let any other part of her body touch him. Their journey began in silence. They rode out of the cottonwood grove and into the harsh, open country. The landscape was a study in desolation, cracked earth, thorny scrub brush, and distant mesas that shimmered like ghosts in the heat. For hours, the only sounds were the plodding hoofbeats of the horse, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of the wind. Elias rode hunched forward, a man at peace with the emptiness around him. For May, the silence was a suffocating blanket. It gave her too much room to think, to remember. The faces of the men at the auction, the feel of the cold iron on her wrist, the endless succession of hands that had pushed and pulled and hurt her. The memories played over and over in her mind. As the sun climbed higher, Elias watched her in the faint reflection from a silver concho on his saddle horn. He saw the way her small frame swayed with the horse's rhythm, her head bowed. The sight of her, so fragile against the vast, unforgiving landscape, was a constant, painful reminder. It pulled him back, dragging him through the years to another hot, dusty afternoon under a merciless sun. The memory was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of his thoughts. But sometimes it broke free with the clarity of a fresh wound. He was a boy of 19 again, his hands raw from gripping the reins of a half-broken horse he had ridden for 3 days straight. He was in a makeshift town on the edge of the Cimarron, a place that reeked of greed and desperation. He had heard the whispers, the rumors of a trader passing through with captives from a raid, and he had known, with a certainty that froze his blood, that his sister Sarah would be among them. He saw her. She was standing on a wooden platform, her dress torn, her blonde hair matted with dirt. She was 15, she was not crying, her face was set in a mask of defiant fury, her blue eyes scanning the crowd of leering, sweating men, searching. And then her eyes found his. He saw the flicker of hope, the desperate plea. He saw her mouth form his name, a silent call across the noise and the dust. The auctioneer was a fat, wheezing man who described her virtues with a sickening relish. A man in a bowler hat made a bid. Another, a rancher with a sprawling brand on his saddle, raised him. Elias sat frozen on his horse, his hand gripping the small pouch of money he had, his entire savings. A pittance. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He should have acted. He should have drawn his gun, started shooting, set the whole damn place on fire. He should have done anything but sit there, helpless, as the bidding climbed higher and higher. He was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it, by the fear of what they would do to him, and to her, if he failed. The rancher won. He swaggered up to the platform, a proprietary grin on his face, and took Sarah by the arm. She fought him. She kicked and spat and screamed his name, a raw, desperate cry that tore through Elias's soul. "Elias, do something!" And he had done nothing. He had watched as the man struck her across the face, silencing her, and dragged her away. He had watched until she was gone. That was the moment the boy in him died, and the cold, silent man began to take his place. He had tracked the rancher for a week, fueled by a black, killing rage, but he was too late. He found her in a shallow grave behind a burned-out line shack. He never knew exactly what happened. He only knew that he had failed. He had hesitated, and she had paid the price. Now, with May's small, warm weight against his back, the old guilt rose up and choked him. This time, he had not hesitated. He had paid, and he had walked away. But he knew, with a grim certainty, that buying her was the easy part. Keeping her safe, healing a wound as deep as hers. That was a debt he would be paying for the rest of his life. By late afternoon, the landscape began to change. The flat, arid plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. They were climbing into higher country. They came upon a small mining town clinging to the side of a mountain. A collection of rough shacks and tents clustered around a deep, gouged-out pit. A sign nailed to a post read, "Prosperity." A cruel joke in a place that looked so utterly forsaken. Elias reined in the horse in front of a building that called itself a general store. "I'll be back," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to speech. He slid from the saddle and looked at May. She shrank from his gaze. "Stay with the horse," he added, his tone flat, a statement of fact, not a command. He went inside. The store was a dim, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and chewing tobacco. The proprietor, a hawk-faced man with suspicious eyes, watched Elias's every move. Elias ignored him. Moving through the narrow aisles, he picked out a sturdy wool dress, the color of a stormy sky, a pair of thick stockings, and leather boots that looked small enough to fit her. He bought a bar of soap, a comb, and a warm woolen blanket. He paid for it all with a few silver coins, his face an impassive mask. When he came back out, a small group of people had gathered, a few miners, their faces permanently stained with grime, and a handful of women, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sharp-edged disapproval. They stared openly at May, who sat on the horse like a frightened bird, her face hidden behind a curtain of tangled hair. Their whispers were not quiet enough. "Look at that! Bought himself some company." "She's just a child." "The quiet ones are the worst, I hear." Their words were like stones, and May flinched with each one. Elias's jaw tightened. He packed the new clothes and supplies into his saddlebags without acknowledging the gawkers. He knew what they saw. A hard-looking drifter and a girl in rags. They would draw the ugliest, most obvious conclusion because it was the easiest one to draw. He had lived his life on the fringes of society for so long that its judgment meant less than nothing to him. But he felt a hot surge of anger at the way their cruel stares fell upon May. She had suffered enough without having to bear the scorn of strangers. As he was about to mount, a woman stepped out of the adjacent saloon. She was young, her face painted with a garish layer of rouge and powder, but her eyes were old and weary. She wore a dress of cheap red satin, and she looked Elias up and down with a practiced, assessing gaze. "You," she said, her voice low and husky, "you ought to keep moving. The folks in this town don't take kindly to men who buy their girls instead of renting them by the hour." She glanced at May, and for a moment, a flicker of something like sympathy crossed her face. "They think you bought a girl for the wrong reasons. And in a town like this, what they think is all that matters. It'll bring you nothing but trouble." Elias met her gaze. He saw no malice in her, only a tired sort of pragmatism. She was warning him, in her own way. He gave a single, curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of her words. Then he swung himself up into the saddle, in front of May. He took the reins and nudged the horse forward, leaving the woman, the town, and their ugly whispers behind. They rode out of prosperity and followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the pine woods. The air grew cooler, scented with the clean, sharp smell of resin. As they rounded a bend, they came upon a small, whitewashed church standing in a clearing. Its paint was peeling, and the cross on its steeple was tilted, but it stood as a lonely beacon of faith in the vast wilderness. At the sight of it, May stiffened behind him. A shudder ran through her entire body. She made a small, choked sound in the back of her throat. Elias slowed the horse, turning slightly to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a look of remembered horror. She was trembling violently. The church, a symbol of sanctuary for some, was clearly a place of terror for her. It was another piece of her shattered past, another locked door in the prison of her mind. She stared at the church, and then her gaze shifted, lifting to meet his. Her lips parted, and for the first time since he had found her, she spoke. Her voice was a dry, cracking whisper, so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. "Why?" The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with 1,000 questions. "Why did you buy me? Why are you not like the others? Why did this happen? Why is there so much cruelty in the world? Why save one person when so many are lost?" Elias had no answer for her. The truth of it was a tangled mess of his own grief and guilt, a story he had never told another living soul. Words were useless things, anyway. They couldn't mend a broken spirit or erase the scars of the past, so he remained silent. He turned his face forward and urged the horse on, leaving the church behind them. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered spot near a rushing river. The sound of the water was a constant, soothing murmur. After he had tended to the horse and started a fire, he reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small object and, after a moment's hesitation, held it out to her. It was a horse, no bigger than her palm, carved from a piece of pale pine wood. It was crudely made, the legs were a little uneven, the lines of the body rough, but it had been carved with care, the mane and tail etched with the tip of a knife. It was a simple, humble thing. May stared at it, then at his outstretched hand. Slowly, as if she expected him to snatch it away. She reached out and took it. The wood was smooth and warm in her cold fingers. She closed her hand around it. A small, solid piece of kindness in a world that had offered her none. It wasn't an answer to her question, but it was something else. It was a gesture. It was a start. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, May thought Elias was asleep. She sat huddled in the new blanket he had bought her, the small wooden horse clutched tightly in her hand. The day's events, the town, the whispers, the church, this man's inexplicable quiet had worn down her defenses. A deep, shuddering sob escaped her, then another. She buried her face in her knees and cried, not the silent, resigned tears of the auction, but the racking, painful sobs of a grief too long held in. She cried for the life she had lost, for the girls who had died at the orphanage, for the terror and the pain and the utter, crushing loneliness of it all. Across the fire, Elias lay in his bedroll, his back to her. He was not asleep. He heard every hitched breath, every muffled cry. He lay perfectly still, his hand resting on the hilt of the long hunting knife at his side. He began to sharpen it against a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a steady, almost meditative sound in the darkness. It was a pretense, a way to seem occupied, to give her the privacy to grieve without feeling watched. He let her tears wash over the camp, a necessary storm. He would guard her through it. His own demons came for him in the deep hours of the night. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. He dreamed he was standing in a field of dead grass under a sky the color of ash. A single wooden cross stood before him, his sister's grave. He fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the hard, unforgiving earth. But the ground turned to smoke beneath his fingers. The scene shifted, and he was surrounded by fire. The cabin was burning again, the flames roaring like a hungry beast, and he could hear Sarah screaming his name from inside. He tried to run toward the flames, but his feet were encased in lead. He couldn't move. He could only stand and watch it burn, the heat scorching his face, her voice growing weaker and weaker until it was finally swallowed by the inferno. Elias woke with a gasp, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke in his nostrils. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the night was cold. He was shivering, though not just from the chill. He sat up, running a shaky hand over his face, trying to banish the images from his mind. A soft rustle from across the camp made him look up. May was awake. She was sitting up in her blanket, her eyes wide and luminous in the faint starlight. She had seen his nightmare. She had watched him thrash and cry out in his sleep. She looked at him now, not with fear, but with a dawning, hesitant understanding. She saw not a captor, not a threat, but a man haunted by his own ghosts. Slowly, she got to her feet. She clutched the new wool blanket, the one he had bought for her, and walked quietly around the dying fire. She approached him with a caution that was ingrained in her every movement. Elias remained perfectly still, watching her. She stopped just behind him, hesitating for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that was a perfect, silent reversal of all that had happened between them, she gently draped the warm, heavy blanket over his trembling shoulders. She didn't speak. She just stood there for a second, her small hand resting lightly on his shoulder, before retreating back to her own side of the fire. The gesture was small, but it was monumental. It was the first choice she had made, the first act of care she had offered. In the cold, silent darkness of the wilderness, a single, fragile thread of trust had been spun. The first snows came early that year, catching the highlands by surprise. One day the sky was a crisp, autumn blue. The next it was a low, bruised ceiling of iron gray. The wind turned sharp, carrying a scent of ice and distant tundras. Elias, reading the signs in the sky and the frantic activity of the squirrels in the pines, knew they couldn't stay in the open. They needed real shelter, a place to ride out the coming storm and the long, bitter winter that would follow. For 2 days they pushed north, climbing higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and colder with every foot. The first flakes began to fall, not in a gentle drift, but in a hard, stinging flurry that swirled on the wind. The buckskin horse, its breath pluming in white clouds, plodded onward, its head low. May, huddled behind Elias, was wrapped in every blanket they owned, a small, silent mound of wool. Just as the light was beginning to fail on the second day, he found it, tucked into a draw. Protected from the worst of the wind by a thick stand of lodgepole pines, was an old trapper's cabin. It was small and rough-hewn, the logs chinked with mud and moss, the roof a steep pitch of packed earth designed to shed heavy snow. Smoke did not rise from its stone chimney, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. It was long abandoned, but it was solid. It was sanctuary. Elias dismounted and pushed open the heavy plank door. It groaned on its leather hinges. The air inside was cold and still, smelling of old wood smoke, pine needles, and the faint, musky scent of the long-gone trapper. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center of the single room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a raised wooden bunk, filled with dried pine boughs, occupied a corner. It was crude, but it was a fortress against the coming winter. For the first few days, a silent routine established itself. Elias was a whirlwind of ceaseless, purposeful activity. He chopped a mountain of firewood from a fallen pine, stacking it neatly against the cabin's outer wall. He repaired a leak in the roof, chinked the logs with fresh mud and moss, and fashioned a new, sturdier door latch. He hunted every day, returning with rabbits, grouse, and once a small deer that would provide them with meat for weeks. He was preparing for a siege, his enemy the relentless cold. May watched him, her hands busy with the tasks he left for her. She swept the dirt floor with a broom of bound twigs, cooked their meals over the fire, and mended a tear in his coat with a needle and thread from his kit. She did it all in the same profound silence she had maintained since he'd bought her. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the frozen, terrified silence of the first few days. Here, in the quiet solitude of the cabin, it had become something softer, more contemplative. The tight, hunted look in her eyes was beginning to loosen. And then, slowly, haltingly, she began to speak. It started one evening as she stared into the dancing flames of the hearth. The firelight cast flickering orange shadows on her face, and her expression was distant, her eyes seeing something far away. "The fire," she whispered, her voice a rusty, unused thing. "It was so bright." Elias, who was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, stopped his work. He didn't turn to look at her, didn't want to startle the words back into hiding. He just sat perfectly still, listening. "They came at night," she continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "Raiders, looking for things to take. We didn't have anything, not really, just us girls." A shudder ran through her. "They set the orphanage on fire, to flush us out." He could hear the terror in that memory, the smell of smoke and the heat of the flames. He said nothing, his hand resting on the cool steel of his rifle. He let her speak, let the poison of the memory seep out into the warm, safe air of the cabin. A few days later, while she was helping him pluck a grouse for their dinner, she spoke again. "There was a girl, Ruth. She was older than me. She was strong." May's fingers stilled on the soft feathers. "She pushed me out a window. At the back, the smoke was thick. I couldn't breathe. She said to run and not look back." May's voice broke on a sob she quickly swallowed. "I looked back. I saw them catch her." Elias's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. He pictured the scene. A brave girl named Ruth sacrificing herself for a smaller one. He thought of his own sister, of his own failure. The weight of May's words settled on him, another stone added to the cairn of grief he carried in his soul. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He couldn't tell her it would be all right, because he knew it wouldn't. The past could not be changed. He simply listened, and in his listening, he shared the burden of her memory. The final piece came a week later, during a blizzard that sealed them inside the cabin, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf. She was sitting on her stool, clutching the small wooden horse he had carved for her. 3 times, she said into the gloom. They sold me 3 times. The first man was a farmer. His wife had died. He wanted a field hand and someone for the nights. The second was a gambler. He lost me in a card game. The third was Silas Croft, the traitor. She spoke the names as if they were a list of diseases she had survived. There was no self-pity in her tone, only a flat, dead recitation of fact. It was a story she had told herself so many times in the silence of her mind that it had lost all its sharp edges, worn down into a smooth, hard pebble of pain. Elias looked at her then, at this child who had endured a lifetime of cruelty. He saw the strength it had taken for her to survive, the resilient core of her that refused to be extinguished, and in his quiet, somber eyes, she saw something she had never seen from anyone else, a deep, aching respect. He didn't see a broken thing he had purchased. He saw a survivor. As the days turned into weeks, the deep snows of winter transformed the world outside into a pristine, silent wilderness of white. The monotony of their existence, the endless cycle of chopping wood, hunting, cooking, and sleeping, began to wear on May. The cabin, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a cage. She would stand at the small window for hours, staring out at the blinding white landscape, a deep and nameless yearning stirring within her. She was safe, she was warm, she was fed, but some part of her soul, the part that remembered sunlight and green grass and the color of wildflowers, was starving. One morning, Elias rose early to check his trap lines. The storm had broken, and the world was freshly blanketed in a thick layer of snow, glittering under a pale sun. He told her he would be back by midday and left, his figure quickly swallowed by the vast, white silence. May went about her morning chores, but a restlessness she couldn't name gnawed at her. She thought of a flower, a memory from a time so long ago it felt like a dream. She had been a little girl, living at the orphanage before the fire, before everything had gone wrong. In the late spring, the meadows behind the orphanage would be ablaze with color. Her favorite was a flower with a fiery red plume, like a brush dipped in sunset. One of the older girls had told her it was called Indian paintbrush. The memory of that vibrant, impossible red against the green grass was a sudden, desperate craving. She needed to see color again. She needed a reminder that the world wasn't only black and white and gray. On a mad, childish impulse, she pulled on the boots Elias had bought her, wrapped herself in a heavy blanket, and stepped outside. The cold was a physical shock, stealing her breath. She told herself she would only go a little way, just to the edge of the trees. Maybe she would find a bright red berry, a colored stone, anything. She walked, her feet sinking deep into the powder. The snow muffled all sound, creating a profound and unnerving silence. She wandered farther than she intended, her eyes scanning the white ground, searching for a speck of color that wasn't there. A sense of hopelessness began to creep in. Of course there were no flowers. It was the dead of winter. It was a fool's errand. She turned to go back, and a wave of panic seized her. She had not been paying attention to her path. In every direction, the landscape looked the same, an endless, rolling sea of snow and trees. Her tracks were already being softened by the breeze, faint suggestions of a path that was rapidly disappearing. She was lost. Elias returned to the cabin a little before noon, 2 plump rabbits hanging from his belt. The moment he stepped inside, he knew the silence was wrong. It was not the quiet, companionable silence he had grown accustomed to, but a dead, empty silence. "May!" he called out, the name feeling strange and rough in his throat. There was no answer. He saw her blanket was gone. and a set of small, lone footprints leading away from the cabin door, heading out into the open. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, gripped him. He dropped the rabbits and burst back outside, his eyes scanning the snow. He was a master tracker, but this was different. This was not the trail of an animal or an enemy. It was the trail of a lost child, and the snow was a patient, relentless predator, erasing her path with every gust of wind. He followed the tracks, his long legs eating up the ground. He could see where she had wandered, where she had stopped, where she had turned in confused circles. He pushed himself harder, his heart pounding with a familiar, sickening fear. The ghost of his sister walked beside him, her phantom voice whispering his greatest terror. "Too late. You will be too late again." He found her huddled at the base of a large pine, her body curled into a tight ball. She was no longer moving. Her face was chalky white, her lips tinged with blue. In her mittened hand, she clutched a single withered stem with a frozen brown blossom on the end, the dead remains of a summer flower she had uncovered in the snow. She had found her piece of color, but it had cost her everything. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands clumsy as he felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, a faint, thready flutter. She was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled him washed over him. He gathered her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, her body limp and cold. He pulled the blanket tighter around her and stood, cradling her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He held her there for a moment, his face buried in her snow-dusted hair, his body trembling with the aftermath of his fear. And then he spoke, his voice hoarse, thick with an emotion he couldn't conceal. It was the first full sentence he had ever said to her. "Don't ever walk away like that again." It was not a command. It was a plea, raw and torn from the deepest part of him. It was the voice of a man who had already lost too much. Back at the cabin, he worked with a desperate urgency. He stripped off her frozen, wet clothes and wrapped her in every dry blanket he had. He built the fire up until it was roaring, filling the small cabin with a sweltering heat. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to force life and warmth back into them. As the feeling began to return to her limbs, the pain started, and with the pain came the tears. She began to weep, not the quiet, soft crying he had heard before, but a storm of grief and terror and relief. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of unshed tears finally being set free. She wept in his arms, her small body convulsing with the force of her sobs. And for the first time, Elias didn't pull away. He held her. He sat on the floor in front of the fire, cradling her like a child, one hand stroking her hair, the other holding her tight against his chest. He let her cry until she was exhausted, until her sobs quieted into hiccuping breaths. It was a different kind of weeping. It wasn't the weeping of fear, it was the weeping of release. That night, the full force of the blizzard returned, more violent than before. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the temperature plummeted. The fire, no matter how high he built it, could not keep the biting cold at bay. Elias knew that if they slept apart, in their separate bedrolls, May, in her weakened state, might not survive the night. When it was time to sleep, he laid his bedroll next to hers on the floor before the hearth. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She understood. There was no lust in his gaze, only a grim, practical concern. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He lay down beside her, on top of the blankets, pulling another layer over both of them. He was careful not to touch her, leaving a small, respectful distance between their bodies. But as the night wore on and the cold deepened, they instinctively moved closer, seeking the simple, animal warmth of another living being. Her back was pressed against his chest, her head tucked just under his chin. He could feel the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. It was an intimacy born not of passion, but of desperation. It was two lonely souls huddling together for warmth against the vast, indifferent cold of the world, and in that shared warmth, in that profound and respectful closeness, something shifted between them. The last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a deep, quiet, and utterly unshakable trust. A few mornings later, the world was quiet again. The sun was shining, and the cabin was filled with a bright, clean light. Elias was mending a strap on his saddle, his hands busy with the familiar work, and then he heard it. It was a sound so unexpected, so fragile, it made him freeze. May was singing. She was sitting at the table, mashing dried berries for a sauce, and she was humming a tune, a soft, simple little melody. Then words came, whispered and faint. It was an old lullaby, her voice hoarse and completely off-key. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He slowly turned his head. She hadn't noticed him watching. She was lost in her task, a small, peaceful smile on her lips. She was finding her voice again, not just to speak of pain, but to create something gentle and beautiful. Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest, a hot stinging behind his eyes. He watched her for a long moment. This girl who had been broken and sold and silenced, who had wandered into a snowstorm searching for a dead flower, now singing a lullaby in a shaft of morning sun. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. He quickly turned away before she could see, wiping it away with the back of his rough hand. He was her rock, her protector. He could not let her see him crack. But the sound of her fragile, off-key song had broken through a wall in him he thought was impenetrable, and it was a wound that felt, for the first time, like healing. The thaw came not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, reluctant retreat of winter. For weeks, the days were a battle between a strengthening sun and the stubborn, deep-packed snow. The world was filled with the sound of dripping water, a constant, musical percussion from the cabin eaves and the melting icicles on the pine boughs. The sharp, clean scent of winter gave way to the rich, fecund smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The promise of new life, green shoots, impossibly vibrant, began to poke through the receding white. For May, the change was a miracle. After the monochrome world of the deep winter, the return of color felt like a personal gift. She would stand at the cabin door for hours, watching a patch of ground slowly reappear, her heart aching with a forgotten kind of hope. The winter in the cabin had been a time of quiet healing, a cocoon of warmth and safety, but the spring brought with it a restlessness, a yearning for open spaces and a wider sky. The same restlessness stirred in Elias, though for different reasons. Their supplies were running low. The deer meat was gone, and their reserves of flour and salt were nearly exhausted. The traps yielded fewer rabbits as the animals began to find easier forage. He knew they could not stay in their mountain sanctuary forever. The world, with all its dangers and demands, was waiting for them. "We need to go to town," he said one morning, his voice flat, stating a fact he clearly did not relish. May looked up from the shirt she was mending. Fear, a cold and familiar serpent, coiled in her stomach. Town meant people. It meant stares and whispers and judgment. But she looked at Elias's grim, determined face, and she nodded. She would not let him see her fear. The winter had forged a new strength in her, a quiet resolve that was as real and solid as the new ground beneath her feet. They packed their few belongings and left the cabin that had been their home, their fortress. As they rode down from the highlands, the landscape transformed around them. The world exploded into a riot of green. The air grew warmer, thick with the buzz of insects and the chatter of birds. May, riding behind Elias, drank it all in, her senses overwhelmed. It was the first spring of her new life. The town they came to was called Redemption. It lay in a shallow valley, a neat collection of clapboard buildings and a single, wide main street. It was larger and more prosperous than the other towns they had passed through, with a handsome brick courthouse and a 2-story hotel. But as they rode down the main street, Elias's posture grew rigid, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. This was not just any town. This was a place he knew. He was recognized almost immediately. A blacksmith, hammering a horseshoe in his open-fronted shop, stopped his work and stared, his eyes narrowing. Two women, gossiping on the steps of the general store, fell silent, their gazes following him with a mixture of fear and hostile curiosity. The past was not dead here. It was waiting for him on every street corner. He reined in the horse in front of the mercantile, dismounting in a single fluid motion. He helped May down, his touch on her elbow a brief, reassuring pressure. "Wait here," he said, his voice lower than usual. As he turned to enter the store, a man stepped out of the sheriff's office across the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick gray mustache and a silver star pinned to his vest. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were hard and knowing. He looked at Elias. Then his gaze flickered to May, and a look of weary resignation settled on his face. "Elias," the man said, his voice a low rumble. He crossed the street, his spurs ringing softly on the hard-packed dirt. "I had a feeling this town's run of peace was about to come to an end." Elias turned slowly. "Sheriff Donnelly," he acknowledged, his tone devoid of warmth. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. His eyes were on May, a quick, assessing glance that took in her clean but simple dress, her worn boots, and the way she stood close to Elias, her hand clutching his sleeve. "I see you're back to your old habits," Donnelly said, his voice laced with a dry, cynical sort of accusation. "Buying girls again. Elias?" The word struck Elias like a physical blow, a muscle feathered in his jaw. He didn't answer, but the silence was charged, heavy with a dark and complicated history. May looked from the sheriff's hard face to Elias's stony profile, a cold knot of dread tightening within her. Donnelly sighed, as if dealing with a troublesome child. "You remember Lily, don't you, the girl from the saloon? You paid her debt, took her away, said you were saving her. A week later she was dead in a ditch 20 miles from here. You claimed it was a fever. Folks around here had other ideas." Elias's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerous. "What folks think has never been my concern." "It's my concern when it happens in my town," the sheriff retorted. "Lily was a troubled girl, but she was one of ours. You come riding in like some dark angel, thinking you can fix what's broken. And you only ever make things worse. So I'll ask you again, plain and simple, what's your business with this one?" He jerked his chin toward May. Before Elias could answer, a voice, slick with malice, cut through the tense air. "Well, look what we have here, if it isn't the saint of lost causes." Two men had just exited the saloon. One was a hulking brute of a man, but the one who had spoken was smaller, with a ferret-like face and mean little eyes. His name was Jed, and he was a man who found his pleasure in the misery of others. He swaggered toward them, a smirk on his face, his eyes crawling over May in a way that made her skin feel thin and cold. "Got yourself a new one, did you, Elias?" Jed sneered, his gaze lingering on May's face, on the neckline of her dress. "This one's prettier than the last. Quieter, too. Looks like you finally bought yourself a proper whore, one that knows how to keep her mouth shut." The word, ugly and sharp, hung in the air. For May, it was a brand, a hot iron searing her skin. It was the word that had been whispered behind her back in every town, the word that defined her in the eyes of the world. It was a cage she had just begun to escape. Something inside Elias snapped, the years of pent-up rage, the guilt over his sister, the frustration of his failed attempt to save Lily, the fierce, protective instinct he felt for the girl standing beside him. It all coalesced into a single, blinding point of fury. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He took one step forward and his fist shot out, a blur of motion. It connected with Jed's jaw with a sickening crack of bone on bone. Jed's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, and he crumpled to the ground in an unconscious heap. The street went silent. The blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of the women, the distant rumble of a wagon. It all stopped. Everyone was staring. Sheriff Donnelly was the first to move. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "That's it, Elias," he said, his voice flat and hard. "You're under arrest. Assault." Elias didn't resist. The fire in him had gone out as quickly as it had ignited, leaving behind a cold, familiar ash of resignation. He slowly raised his hands as two deputies rushed forward and grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. As they led him toward the jail, he looked back at May. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. She looked as lost and alone as she had the day he first saw her. May stood frozen on the street, the town's hostile stares pressing in on her from all sides. They were whispering again, their voices a venomous buzz. "See, I told you he was trouble." "That girl's the cause of it. She'll be back on the street by nightfall." Their words were a physical force, pushing the air from her lungs. Her first instinct, ingrained by years of trauma, was to run, to hide, to make herself invisible. But then she saw Elias's face as they pushed him through the jailhouse door. It was a mask of stone, but she saw the flicker of despair in his eyes, the same despair she had once felt herself. He had fought for her. He had defended her honor when she had none left to defend. He had been her rock, her shield, her silent protector. And now he was in a cage because of her. A new feeling, fierce and unfamiliar, rose up in her, stronger than her fear. It was a feeling of loyalty. It was a feeling of love. She took a deep breath, straightened her small shoulders, and walked across the street, her worn boots making a determined sound on the dirt. She walked past the staring women and the scowling men, her gaze fixed on the door of the sheriff's office. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke and gun oil. Sheriff Donnelly sat behind a large oak desk. Elias stood in front of it, his hands cuffed behind his back. Two deputies flanked him. They all turned to look at her as she entered. "Get out of here, girl," Donnelly said, his voice not unkind, but firm. "This is no place for you." May's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. Her hands were trembling, and her throat was tight with fear. But she thought of Elias, sleeping in the rain to give her a warm bed. She thought of him finding her in the snow, his voice thick with fear as he pleaded with her not to walk away. She thought of the small wooden horse she still kept in her pocket. She took another breath, and she found her voice. It started as a whisper, fragile and thin. "Please," she said. "Please, you have to let him go." Donnelly leaned back in his chair, a cynical look in his eyes. "And why should I do that? He nearly broke a man's jaw in the middle of my street." "That man," May's voice faltered. She looked at the floor, the old shame washing over her. But then she lifted her head, and she met the sheriff's gaze, her own eyes, clear and blue and filled with a desperate sincerity. Held his... Her voice grew stronger, clearer. "That man said a terrible thing to me, a cruel thing. Elias, he was just protecting me. It's what he does. He protects people." She took a step forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "You don't know him. You see what you want to see. You see a drifter, a troublemaker. But you're wrong." The words came faster now, tumbling out of her in a rush of pure, unvarnished truth. "He is a good man. When I had nothing, when I was treated worse than an animal, he bought me to save me. He gave me food and clothes. He gave me a warm place to sleep. He has never, not once, laid a hand on me in anger. He has never asked for anything in return. He saved my life." The room was silent. The deputies looked uncomfortable. Even Donnelly's hard expression softened slightly. They had all expected a frightened, incoherent girl. They were not prepared for this quiet, eloquent dignity. They were not prepared for the fierce, unwavering truth in her eyes. Elias stood motionless, his back to her, but he heard every word. He felt them sink into him, a balm on old wounds he thought would never heal. He had spent years seeing himself as a failure, a man who was always too late, who only ever made things worse. But in her words, he heard a different story. He heard a story of salvation. May's speech ended, and she stood there, trembling with the effort, tears streaming down her face. But she did not look away from the sheriff. She had spoken her truth. She had found her voice and used it, not for herself, but for him. Sheriff Donnelly looked at her for a long, silent moment. He looked at the passion and the honesty in her tear-stained face. He looked at the rigid, silent back of the man in cuffs. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man conceding a fight he had already lost. "All right," he said, his voice a low grumble. He nodded to one of the deputies. "Unlock him." The deputy hesitated, then moved to uncuff Elias. "But there are conditions," Donnelly continued, his voice hard again. He leveled a finger at Elias. "I want you out of my town. I want you out of this county. If I ever see your face in Redemption again, I will throw you in a cell and lose the key. Do you understand me?" Elias turned, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. He looked at May, his gray eyes filled with an emotion she had never seen there before. It was a look of profound gratitude, of awe. He then turned to the sheriff and gave a single, curt nod. "We'll be gone before sunset." They camped that night in a deep, narrow canyon carved by a river that had long since dried up. The sheer rock walls rose up on either side of them, a fortress of stone that blocked out the rest of the world. A sliver of the night sky was visible above, studded with brilliant, cold stars. The fire crackled in the darkness, its light dancing on the ancient, weathered rock. They sat in silence for a long time, the events of the day settling around them like a heavy blanket. Elias stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. May watched him, sensing that the walls he had built around himself were finally beginning to crumble. "My sister's name was Sarah," he said, his voice rough, unused to confession. He didn't look at her. He just spoke to the fire. She was younger than me, all blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow in the winter. He paused, and the silence was filled with the weight of that memory. "There were raiders, same as with your orphanage. They took her, they sold her at an auction, just like they did with you." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but May could feel the agony simmering just beneath the surface. "I was there," he said, the words a physical effort, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, dark well. "I saw it happen. I saw them drag her away. She screamed my name. She begged me to do something." He finally looked up from the fire, and his eyes met hers. They were filled with a bleak, ancient pain. "And I did nothing. I just sat on my horse, frozen. I was a boy. I was afraid. I had a handful of dollars and they had a dozen guns. I told myself there was nothing I could do, but that was a lie. I could have died trying. That would have been better than doing nothing." He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if he didn't recognize them. "I hesitated too long. By the time I found her, it was too late. I failed her. That failure has been the only thing that's been real to me for 10 years. He fell silent. The confession was over. He had given her the broken, ugly truth of who he was, the secret that had shaped him into the silent, haunted man she knew. May's heart ached for him, for the boy who had been forced to watch an unspeakable horror and had carried the blame for it ever since. She moved from her spot across the fire and knelt beside him. She reached out a tentative hand and gently touched the faint, silvery scar that ran along his jawline, a relic from some long-ago fight. Her touch was light as a feather. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. She looked into his haunted eyes, and her own were clear and steady. Her voice was soft, but it held the strength of absolute conviction. "You didn't fail me," she said. The words were a balm, a cool hand on a fevered brow. They were absolution. He had failed his sister. He had failed Lily. The world saw him as a failure, but she did not. In her eyes, he was the man who had ridden into the rain and pulled her out of the mud. He was the man who had not hesitated. He stared at her, the truth of her words slowly breaking through a decade of self-loathing. He saw not a girl he had saved, but a woman who was now saving him. A profound, unspoken understanding passed between them in the flickering firelight. He slowly leaned forward, and she met him halfway. He put a hand on her cheek, his calloused thumb gently stroking her skin, and in the deep, quiet darkness of the canyon, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not of hunger or of need. It was a kiss of profound and solemn acknowledgement. It was a seal on a silent promise. It was the taste of tears and wood smoke and the quiet, desperate hope of two broken souls beginning to heal each other. It was the first word in a language they were just beginning to learn. The days that followed their departure from redemption were quiet, imbued with a new, fragile intimacy. The kiss in the canyon had not been a beginning of loud declarations or fumbling passions, but a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had been growing between them since that first rainy night. They rode closer now, May's hands resting lightly on Elias's waist instead of gripping the saddle. The silence between them was no longer a void of fear or uncertainty, but a comfortable space they shared, filled with unspoken understanding. They were two halves of a whole, scarred and weathered, but fitting together in a way that made them both stronger. They traveled north, keeping to the foothills, avoiding towns and settlements. Elias hunted, May foraged, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, the vast, star-dusted sky their only roof. For the first time in her memory, May felt a sense of peace, a feeling so alien and precious she was almost afraid to breathe, for fear of it vanishing like smoke. Their fragile peace was shattered on a dusty afternoon when they spotted a lone rider approaching from the south, his horse moving at a desperate, stumbling gallop. Elias instinctively moved to put himself between the rider and May, his hand resting on his colt. The man was a prospector, his face burned by the sun and etched with panic. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt, his eyes wild. "Headed north?" the man gasped, his throat raw with thirst and fear. "Turn back! There's devils on this road!" Elias handed him his waterskin. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice a low, steady calm. The prospector drank greedily before wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. "A trader, a fat man with a fancy waistcoat. Silas Croft, he called himself. He's got 2 hired guns with him, hard men, and he's got a cage on the back of his wagon." The man's eyes were haunted. "There were girls in it, 3 of them, just children. They looked like their eyes. God, their eyes were hollowed out like gourds. He's taking them up to the mining camps in the territories, taking them to hell." The name, Silas Croft, struck May with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted. The sunlight seemed to dim. She could feel the phantom weight of the chain on her wrist, taste the mud and despair of perdition's folly. She looked at Elias and saw the blood drain from his face, his expression hardening into a familiar mask of cold stone. The peace was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The past had found them. That night, the comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense, crackling quiet. Elias cleaned his rifle with a meticulous, focused intensity that frightened May. He was a different man now. The gentle protector was gone, and in his place was the hardened gunfighter, the hunter. "You're going after him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was not a question. He didn't look up from his work. "Yes." "No." The word was a choked plea. She moved to him, kneeling in the dirt beside him. "Elias, please, we have enough. We have this. Don't go back to that. It will destroy you." "It's not a choice, May." "Yes, it is," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "It is always a choice. You don't have to save everyone. You saved me. Isn't that enough?" He finally stopped his work and looked at her. His gray eyes were bleak, like a winter sky. If a man sees a snake in the path, he kills it, not because he hates that one snake, but because he knows it will bite the next person to come along. Croft is a snake. Leaving him on the path is the same as letting him bite. "This isn't about a snake," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "This is about you. This is vengeance for your sister. I see it in your eyes, and it will get you killed." "This isn't vengeance," he said, his voice low and raw. "Vengeance is a fire that burns a man from the inside out. I've had enough of fire. This is about justice. It's about those girls in that cage. They are you. They are Sarah. If I ride away now, I'm no better than the boy who sat on his horse and did nothing." She knew she had lost. His guilt was a deeper, older wound than his love for her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Please," she whispered into her palms. "Don't go looking for the fire." He reached out and gently touched her hair. "I have to—" He left before dawn. May lay in her bedroll, feigning sleep, and listened to the soft sounds of his departure, the quiet creak of saddle leather, a muffled word to his horse, and then the faint, receding hoofbeats fading into the darkness. When he was gone, a profound and terrible silence descended. She was alone again. The feeling was a cold, familiar ache in her bones. Everyone left. Her parents, Ruth, the other girls at the orphanage, they had all left her, one way or another. But as the sun began to cast a pale light over the horizon, something shifted in her. She thought of the strength in his hands, the sorrow in his eyes, the quiet way he had given her a piece of himself. He had faced down her demons. She could not let him face his own alone. The frightened girl who had cried in the mud was gone. A woman, forged in the fires of a hard winter and a quiet love, rose in her place. She moved with a silent, determined purpose. She packed a small bag with water, dried meat, and bandages. She took the small wooden horse from her pocket and clutched it for a moment, a prayer to a silent God. Then she set off on foot, following the tracks of his horse, her small figure a resolute shadow in the growing light. She was a good tracker, a skill learned from a childhood spent largely outdoors, but he was better. She kept a careful distance, staying to the low ground, using the terrain for cover. For 2 days she followed him, a ghost he never knew was there. She found them in a narrow box canyon late on the second day. The trader's wagon was parked near a small spring, the horses unhitched. A campfire burned merrily. Silas Croft sat on a stool, drinking from a flask, while his 2 hired guns lounged nearby, their rifles within easy reach. The cage was on the back of the wagon, just as the prospector had described. May's stomach turned when she saw the 3 small, pale faces peering out from between the bars. She scrambled up the side of the canyon, finding a perch on a rocky ledge that overlooked the camp. She could see Elias concealed behind a jumble of boulders at the canyon's entrance, his rifle resting on a rock, aimed at the camp below. He was waiting. For what? She did not know. Nightfall? A moment of carelessness? But the moment was taken from him. One of the hired guns, a wiry man with nervous eyes, stood up to relieve himself. He walked away from the fire, his path taking him dangerously close to Elias's hiding place. Elias was exposed. May's heart leaped into her throat. Down below, Elias had seen the danger. He rose slowly, his rifle held ready. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The camp exploded into action. The wiry man swore and clawed for his pistol. The second gunman rolled behind the wagon, bringing his rifle up. Silas Croft kicked over his stool and scrambled for cover. "I don't want to kill you," Elias said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the sudden chaos. "My business is with Croft. You 2 can ride out of here and live to see another sunrise." "He's paying us good money, friend," the second gunman yelled from behind the wagon. "More than you've got. I'd wager." At that moment, May saw something that made her blood run cold. The wiry man, pretending to surrender, was slowly raising his pistol, using Elias's focus on the second gunman as a distraction, but from her vantage point. She also saw something Elias could not. Silas Croft, his face a mask of sweating terror, had crawled to the back of the wagon, retrieved a shotgun, and was now leveling it at Elias's exposed back. There was no time to think. There was only instinct, a raw, primal need to protect him. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice a raw, tearing cry that ripped through the canyon. "Behind you!" Her scream made every man in the canyon flinch. Elias, reacting instantly to her voice, spun around just as the shotgun roared. The blast, which would have hit him square in the back, instead tore through his side, sending him staggering backward. The wiry man's pistol shot went wide. Elias, though grievously wounded, did not fall. He brought his rifle up and fired once. The wiry gunman crumpled to the ground. The second gunman, seeing his partner fall and hearing the warning cry from an unseen shooter in the hills, decided he wasn't being paid enough to die. He threw his rifle down and ran, scrambling up the far side of the canyon and disappearing over the ridge. Silas Croft stared, his shotgun smoking, his face slack with shock. He was alone. He looked up at Elias, who was now leaning heavily against a boulder, his shirt turning a dark, wet red. Elias leveled his rifle at the traitor's chest. "It's over, Croft!" Elias gasped, his voice tight with pain. He didn't kill him. He disarmed him, tied him up, and then, with his remaining strength, he shot the lock off the cage. 3 girls, none older than 14, stumbled out, blinking in the splintered sunlight, their bodies thin and their eyes wide with a terror so deep it was almost catatonic. May scrambled down the canyon wall, her feet slipping on the loose rock. She ran to Elias, her heart in her throat. He had slumped to the ground, his back against the rock, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Elias," she breathed, falling to her knees beside him. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her hands trembling so violently she could barely tie a knot. The wound was bad, a ragged, bleeding tear in his side. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with a fierce, unwavering focus. "The girls! May!" he rasped. "Get them some water. Get them away from him." May looked at the 3 girls, who stood huddled together like frightened fawns. She saw herself in their eyes. She took a deep breath, forcing her own panic down. She walked over to them, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft and steady. "My name is May. You're safe now." She led them to the spring, gave them water, and wrapped them in blankets from the wagon. When she returned to Elias, his eyes were closed. For a terrible moment, she thought he was dead. She put a trembling hand to his chest and felt the slow, steady beat of his heart. Relief, sharp and painful, lanced through her. She finished binding his wound as best she could, her small hands covered in his blood. She knelt beside him, her head bowed, and whispered into the quiet of the canyon, her voice thick with tears and a desperate, ragged fear. "Don't you die," she said, her words a fierce, desperate prayer. "Don't you dare leave me like they all did." They had to move, and quickly. She knew that the escaped gunman would bring others. She managed to get Elias onto his horse, his body a dead weight she somehow hoisted into the saddle. She put the 3 freed girls onto the wagon horses, and, taking the reins of Elias's buckskin, she led them out of the canyon, leaving Silas Croft tied up for whatever justice might find him. They rode into the hills, a small, ragged band of fugitives. May's fear was a cold, constant companion. By the second day, she saw riders in the distance, a posse. They were being pursued, but the men chasing them weren't lawmen coming to help. They were bounty hunters. The gunman had told his story, a twisted version where a ruthless kidnapper named Elias had stolen Croft's property and shot his partner. Once again, the world had judged Elias and found him guilty. They found refuge in a secluded aspen grove, the white trunks of the trees a ghostly cage around them. Elias was fading, lost in the grip of a fever. May tended to him, cleaning his wound, forcing water between his cracked lips. The three girls watched her, their silence a heavy shroud. In a moment of lucidity, Elias's eyes opened. He looked at her, his gaze clearing. He reached up a weak hand and touched her cheek. "I didn't save you because you were broken," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He wanted her to know, needed to tell her before the fever took him again. "I saved you because you were worth it." Tears streamed down May's face, dripping onto his hand. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "And I stayed," she replied, her voice choked with emotion, giving him her own final, absolute truth. "Because you were the first one who never asked for anything." Hope was a dangerous thing in a land that offered so little of it, but it was all May had left, with Elias fading in the saddle, a dead weight held in place only by her will. She guided their small, desperate caravan through the labyrinthine hills. The three freed girls, their names still unknown, followed silently, their eyes large and haunted. They were a flock of lost lambs led by a shepherd who was herself just learning to stand. Just when the last of her strength was giving out, when the sun was a merciless hammer and Elias's breathing had grown terrifyingly shallow, she saw it, tucked into a crease in the hills, almost invisible until you were upon it, was a small homestead. It was a low, adobe house with a roof of red tiles, surrounded by a garden of chili peppers, corn, and strange, fragrant herbs. A thin tendril of smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. A sense of profound peace seemed to emanate from the place, a stark contrast to the harsh country around it. An old woman was on her knees in the garden, her hair a long, silver braid down her back, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. She looked up as they approached, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the blood-soaked bandages on the man, the terror in the eyes of the girls, the desperate exhaustion on the face of the one leading them. She rose slowly, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron, her expression calm and accepting, as if she had been expecting them all along. "You are in need of sanctuary," she said, her voice soft, with the lyrical accent of the South. It was not a question. Her name was Elena, and her home was a haven for those the world had broken. She had been a healer, a curandera, for 50 years, and she knew the wounds of the body and the soul were often intertwined. Without a word of judgment, she helped May get Elias inside, onto a cool, clean cot in a small, whitewashed room. She examined the wound with practiced hands, her touch gentle but firm. "The ball has gone clean through," she said, her voice a soothing murmur. "That is a blessing, but the fever is a demon. We must fight it now." For the next week, the small room became May's entire world. Elena showed her which herbs to boil for a poultice, which leaves to brew for a tea to fight the infection. But the true nursing fell to May. She was a tireless, silent sentinel. She bathed Elias's sweat-drenched body with cool cloths, forced sips of water and broth between his cracked lips, and changed the dressings on his wound with a stomach-churning resolve she never knew she possessed. The three other girls, whose names she learned were Clara, Sophia, and Isabel, huddled in the main room, slowly coming back to life under Elena's quiet care. But May rarely left Elias's side. Every night, she would sit in a straight-backed chair beside his cot, the firelight from the main room casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and on her lap, heavy and cold and solid, rested Elias's Colt Peacemaker. She had taken it from his gun belt, cleaned it, and reloaded it with a steady hand. The feel of the polished wood grip and the cold steel was a comfort, a transfer of his strength to her. The girl who had flinched at every shadow was gone. In her place was a guardian, a woman who would meet any threat that dared to enter that room with a bullet. She would not let the world take another thing from her. Elias was lost in the gray, swirling fog of the fever. He thrashed and mumbled, his mind trapped in a landscape of past horrors. He spoke to men May did not know, relived gunfights on dusty streets, and crossed endless, burning deserts. But one name, one word, returned again and again, a raw, tormented whisper that tore at May's heart. "Sarah." He would reach out a trembling hand into the empty air, his brow furrowed in agony. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was too slow." The first time she heard it, May thought it was the name of a lost love, and a sharp, unfamiliar pang of jealousy shot through her. But as she listened to his delirious ramblings, to the fragmented images of smoke and fire and a boy's helpless fear, the truth settled upon her. This was not a lover. This was his sister. This was the ghost that had haunted him for a decade, the failure that had driven him to save a broken girl in the rain. She finally understood. His quest to save her, to save the girls in the cage, had never been about her worthiness or their innocence. It was about his own. He was trying to save himself from the memory of a boy who had done nothing. Listening to him call out for his sister, May's love for him deepened, transforming from a simple gratitude into a fierce, aching empathy. She saw the full depth of his wound and knew that her own healing was inextricably bound to his. She took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his, and held on tight, as if she could anchor him to the present, to her. "I'm here, Elias," she would whisper into the hot, still air of the room. "It's May. You're not too late this time." Slowly, painstakingly, he began to return to her. The fever broke one evening in a torrent of sweat, leaving him weak and spent, but lucid. His eyes, when they opened and focused on her, were clear. He looked at her sitting in the chair, at the heavy revolver in her lap, and a faint, weary smile touched his lips. He had gone into the fire, and she had pulled him out. His recovery was slow. For weeks he was too weak to do more than sit in a chair in the sun, his body lean and gaunt, the wound in his side a puckered, angry scar. While he rested, May found a new purpose. She felt a deep, primal need to create, to nurture, to bring forth life in a world that had shown her only death. She asked Elena for a small patch of ground at the edge of the main garden. With a trowel and a fierce determination, she turned the hard, dry soil. She cleared the rocks and weeds, her hands growing calloused and strong. Elena gave her seeds, squash, beans, and a few precious flower seeds she had saved in a small clay pot. May planted them with a reverence that was almost a prayer. Every day she watered the small plot, tending to the tiny green shoots as they emerged with a devotion that was fierce and tender. This was her first act of permanence, her first claim on the future. She was not just a survivor, drifting from one disaster to the next. She was a planter, a grower. She was putting down roots. Word came from a traveling vaquero that the bounty on Elias had grown, the story told by the escaped gunman, and likely embellished by Silas Croft, had spread. Elias was now a wanted man in 3 territories, a notorious kidnapper and killer with a price on his head that would make a desperate man bold. Elena knew they could not stay forever. Her sanctuary was hidden, but it was not impenetrable. One evening, she brought them 2 bundles of clothing and a pair of worn leather pouches containing official-looking documents. "Your names are now Jacob and Anna Miller," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "You are a farmer and his wife from Missouri, heading south to the New Mexico territory to buy a small plot of land. Your story is simple. You must learn it. You must become it." The new identities were a gift of unimaginable value, a chance to wash away the past and start anew. But the thought of leaving the safety of Elena's homestead was terrifying. This small adobe house had become the only true home May had ever known. The day before they were to leave, Elena led them to a large, ancient juniper tree that stood alone on a small rise behind the house. Its branches were gnarled and twisted by a century of wind and sun. The air beneath it was cool and smelled of resin and dry earth. "The law of men has brought you nothing but pain," Elena said, her dark eyes moving from Elias's face to May's. "It is a clumsy, cruel thing, but there is an older law, a law of the heart, of two souls who have found each other in the darkness." She took a small leather cord from her pocket. She had them stand before her, facing each other. She took Elias's hand and then May's, and gently tied their wrists together with the cord. "There are no priests here, no books," she said softly. "There is only this tree and the sky and the truth that I see in your eyes. Do you, Elias, take this woman, May, to be your shelter in the storm, to guard her heart as you would your own life?" Elias looked at May. He saw not the broken girl from the auction, but the woman who had screamed his name in the canyon, the guardian who had sat vigil by his bed with his gun in her lap, the gardener who had coaxed life from the dead earth. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "I do." Elena turned to May. "And do you, May, take this man, Elias, to be your anchor in the flood, to trust in his strength and to lend him yours when he falters?" May looked at the man who had bought her, saved her, and shown her a kindness she had never believed was possible. She saw the deep sorrow in his eyes, but she also saw the unshakable goodness that lay beneath it. "I do," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Elena smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Then you are married not by the law, but by blessing. Go south, find your hidden valley, and do not look back." She untied the cord and gave it to May. Their union was sealed, not with a ring of gold, but with a simple leather knot and the blessing of a wise old woman under an ancient tree. They rode out the next morning, heading south. The three girls, Clara, Sophia, and Isabel, stayed behind, safe under Elena's care. Elias was stronger now, and he sat tall in the saddle, but this time, May did not ride behind him. She rode in front, held securely in the circle of his arms, her back resting against his chest. As they traveled, a profound change came over Elias. The silence that had been his armor for so long began to fall away. He started to speak, not of the past, not of pain and guilt, but of simple, beautiful things. He had been a lonely boy, and the natural world had been his only companion. He shared that world with her now. He told her the names of the constellations that blazed in the clear desert nights, stories his own father had told him of the great bear and the hunter. He pointed out the different desert flowers, the pale, ghostly bloom of the yucca and the vibrant, defiant red of the ocotillo. He spoke of the stars he had studied as a child and the names of the desert flowers he had learned. His voice, once used only for curt commands or pained confessions, was now a low, gentle murmur, a current of peace that flowed between them. May listened, her heart full, as the last of the walls around the man she loved crumbled into dust. Days later, they found it. It was a small, hidden valley, nestled between two high mesas, with a clear stream running through it and a grove of cottonwood trees for shade. It was a place where they could disappear, a place where Jacob and Anna Miller could build a life. They stopped their horse at the valley's entrance, looking down at the green, peaceful land below them. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a soft, golden light. It was the end of a long, hard journey. It was the beginning of everything. May leaned her head back against Elias's chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. She was home. She was safe. She was loved. The knowledge was as real and solid as the man holding her. She looked out at the valley, her eyes open, dry, and peaceful for the first time in her memory. She pressed her forehead to his chest and spoke, her voice a soft murmur against the rough fabric of his shirt. "You never said it," she said. But I know now. Elias held her tighter, his chin resting on the top of her head. He looked out over their valley, their future. His voice, when he replied, was a low, rough whisper, filled with the weight of all he had paid. I didn't need to say it, he said. I just paid everything to prove it. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from to connect with fellow story lovers. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.